She stands in a gray light, very still. One side of her body is the color of a hand held close to a low fire, that particular warm tone of living skin, faintly golden, where the light catches it, the ordinary color of someone who has been outside in the cold and come in again, can someone whose blood is moving through them in the usual way. The other side is different. The other side is the deep blue black of river ice, seen from beneath, the color of a bruise at its darkest hour, the color of water at the bottom of a very deep well. These two halves meet along a precise line that runs from the crown of her head straight down through the center of her body to the ground, as though someone once drew a single careful mark through the middle of a thing, and one side remembered warmth, and the other side remembered cold, and neither side forgot. This is the figure the Norse tradition calls Helen. The oldest source that describes her in any detail is the Prose Edda, a 13th century Icelandic text compiled by the scholar and chieftain Snorri Sturluson, who drew on far older oral traditions to set down what he understood of the Norse mythological world. In the section of the Prose Edda called Gylfaginning, meaning roughly the deceiving of Gylfi, Snorri describes Helfa with the kind of plainness that very old mythological accounts often have. A plainness that does not try to make the figure frightening or marvelous, but simply says what is there. She is the daughter of Loki. Her mother is Angrboda. She has 2 colors of skin, divided equally, and she rules the dead. That is how it begins. Not dramatically, but precisely. Loki is one of the most complex figures in the Norse tradition, a shape changer, a boundary crosser, a god who is not quite a god in the sense the Aesir are gods, bound to them by an old oath, but not born among them, always operating somewhere between what they are and what their enemies are. He is associated above all with transformation and transgression, with the making of things that should not exist, and the saying of things that cannot be unsaid. He has several children across different couplings in the tradition, but the 3 he fathers with Angrboda occupy a particular place in the mythological structure. They are the ones whose existence threatens the cosmic order in ways that cannot be contained, only managed. Angrboda lives in Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, a place that in Norse cosmology represents not simply physical size, but a kind of primordial wildness, the world as it was before the gods imposed order on it. Her name, in most translations, means something close to she who brings grief, or she who gives warning of grief, or she who announces suffering. It is not a soft name. It is not a name that suggests the children born from her would be mild presences in the world, and they are not. But in the moment of their origin, in whatever scene the tradition imagines taking place in the fog and cold of Jotunheim, before any of their fates have been decided, they are simply 3 children beside a mother, whose name is already a form of prophecy, standing in a world that does not yet know what any of them will become. The 3 children are Hel and Fenrir and Jormungandr. Fenrir is the wolf. In the tradition, Fenrir grows at an alarming rate, and the gods eventually bind him with a magical chain called Gleipnir, a thing made of impossible materials, the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird, and he remains bound at the edge of the world until Ragnarök, at which point he will break free and swallow Odin whole. Jormungandr is the serpent, so vast that the gods cast it into the ocean surrounding Midgard, the realm of humans, and it grew until it encircled the entire world and caught its own tail in its mouth. At Ragnarök, Jormungandr will rise from the sea, and Thor will kill it, and the poison will kill Thor in return, and both of them will fall. These are not incidental figures. They are among the most consequential beings in the entire mythological structure, and they begin here in the same scene of origin as Hell, three figures whose existences are already threaded through with the end of things from the moment they first exist. What the tradition does with Hell once the gods become aware of these three children follows a pattern. The gods of Asgarth, troubled by what they foresaw in the children of Loki and Angrboda, brought all three to Asgarth, to the realm of the gods themselves. Odin is the one who acts. He addresses each of the three in a different way, assigning each a different direction, a different domain, a different kind of containment or sovereignty. Fenrir stays in Asgarth for a time, growing, until the binding becomes necessary. Jormungandr is cast into the sea, and Hel is cast downward. The way Snorri describes this casting is not dramatic in the way a punishment might be dramatic. There is no trial, no accusation, no scene of conflict. Odin simply does what he does, makes a decision, and enacts it with the finality that belongs to whoever holds the power to determine the shape of the cosmos. Hel goes downward. She goes into Niflheim, and Odin grants her authority over all the dead who do not die in battle, those who die of sickness, of old age, of accident, of causes quiet and unheroic and simply human. Her realm is called by her name. She is the place and the ruler of the place simultaneously. The way in Norse and other ancient traditions, the name of a figure and the name of their domain can be the same word, the person and the country they embody, folded together into a single sound. It is worth sitting with this quality of the Norse tradition for a moment, the way a name can carry both a being and a location inside it, because the name itself is one of the most interesting things about Hel. The word Hel derives from a Proto-Germanic root that linguists write as *halja, asterisk, which can be translated as the concealed place, the covered place, the hidden place. It is connected to the Proto-Germanic verb *halon, which means to cover, to hide, to conceal. This verb shows up in many descendant languages. In Old English, Helenar, in Old High German, Helenar, in the Dutch Helenar, in various forms across the Germanic language family. What it points toward is not punishment. It is not a word about fire or torment or the active suffering of those inside. It is a word about covering, about something being placed beneath, drawn over, hidden from view. The same root is present in the English word helmet, the thing that covers the head, and in the word hull, the body of a ship that rides below the waterline, the concealed part, and in the word hall itself, in some analyses, the covered place, the place beneath a roof, the interior space defined by what it encloses. When the Norse speakers said *Helan, they were describing what happens when soil is drawn over a grave mound, the slow movement of earth being arranged over something until the shape beneath it is no longer visible from above, until the ground is level and smooth and there is no indication from the surface of what lies underneath. The word is the sound of that process, and the name Hel carries that sound inside it. Not terror, not damnation, but concealment, the patient covering over of what the earth receives. This etymology has been noted by scholars who have traced the word through the Germanic language family and compared it with cognate terms in related traditions. The concept of the underworld as the covered place, the place beneath the surface, is older than any specific Norse telling of Hela's story. It belongs to a way of thinking about death that is grounded in the physical reality of burial, the body going into the earth, beneath the earth, concealed beneath the earth, rather than in any moral geography of reward and punishment. The underworld in this understanding is simply where the covered things are, and hell is its name, and the name of the figure who rules it. Snorri describes her physical appearance with this same plainness. Half of her body is the color of living human flesh, the other half is dark, and the word Snorri uses is generally translated as blue-black, or dark blue, or black, with some scholars noting that the Old Norse term he uses connects to the color of something dead and darkened, the skin of a corpse in its particular discoloration, not rotting, not horrifying, not dramatically decomposed in the way horror might imagine, simply dark, simply cold in color, simply the other side of living. She is described as having a downcast or gloomy expression in some readings of Snorri's text, though others read the relevant word more neutrally, as simply a kind of stillness or severity of face, the expression of someone who has an enormous responsibility and takes it seriously, without particular emotion. What Snorri's description gives us, standing back from it and looking at what the image actually does, is a figure who is a complete and embodied symbol of the threshold she governs, the living side and the dead side, meeting at a single line down the center of the body, held in the same form, neither one canceling the other out, neither one more important than the other. She is not depicted as belonging to one world or the other. She belongs to the boundary. She is the boundary. In the same way, she is both the ruler of the realm and the name of the realm. Her physical form is the threshold made visible. In the traditions of other cultures, figures who govern the boundary between the living world and the dead world are often described with similar kinds of doubleness. But it is worth staying inside the Norse tradition rather than reaching for comparisons that flatten what is specific about hell into something more familiar. What the Norse tradition gives her is not a judge's throne or a set of scales. What it gives her is a body that is precisely divided, a form that simply shows what she is without requiring any judgment about what that means. She is not more frightening on one side than the other. She is not more welcoming on one side than the other. She is not more welcoming on one side than the other. Both sides simply are what they are, held in the same figure, standing in the same gray light. The gray light itself is worth noticing. Hell's realm, when the tradition describes it, is a place of low, cold light, diffuse and sourceless, not the darkness of absolute night, but the particular quality of light, in a world where no sun has ever risen, a world where everything is visible, but nothing is warm, where the light does not come from any direction that can be named, and in that light her two-toned body would look exactly as described, the warm side perhaps slightly more visible, the dark side perhaps slightly harder to see clearly, both of them part of the same figure standing still and unhurrying in the middle of a place that has all the time that exists. The tradition holds that Odin's decision about what to do with the children of Loki and Angrboda came from foresight, from his understanding of what these figures would become and what their existences meant for the eventual fate of the cosmos. The Norse cosmological tradition is unusually explicit about the fact that the cosmos ends, that Ragnarok is not a possibility but a certainty, that the gods know this and have always known it, and that the shape of their decisions about how to manage the figures who will eventually participate in that ending is governed by this knowledge. Fenrir must be bound because of what he will do. Jormungandr must be contained in the ocean because of what it will become, and Hel must be given sovereignty over the dead, which in a sense contains her too, gives her a domain and a function and a reason to stay within it. But Hel's assignment is different from her siblings in an important way. Fenrir and Jormungandr are contained, bound, cast, their power temporarily neutralized against the eventual day when it cannot be neutralized further. Hel is given authority. She is given a realm and the dead who fill it, and the function she performs within that realm is not a holding action against a threat, but the orderly governance of an enormous and permanent institution. She receives what Odin sends to her. She rules what the cosmos delivers. The Prose Edda describes her as having authority over the 9 worlds, in the sense of receiving the dead from all of them. She is not being managed by the gods. She is doing her work with the seriousness of someone who understands that the work will never be finished. There is something in the structure of this arrangement that reflects a broader quality of the Norse mythological tradition, the willingness to depict the divine order as genuinely dependent on figures who are not straightforwardly good, who come from the wrong lineage, who have the wrong appearance, who were not born in the right place or in the right way. The Norse gods need Loki, even knowing what Loki is, because Loki does things that need doing and that no one else can do. And the Norse cosmos needs Hel, even though she is the daughter of Loki and the giantess of grief, even though half her body is the color of a corpse, because without someone to receive the dead who do not die in battle, there is no order in the world below, only chaos in the place that all the cosmos eventually passes through. She is not a marginal figure. She is one of the structural necessities of the Norse cosmological world. The 3 siblings together form a kind of picture of the 3 directions in which the thread of Ragnarok waits. Fenrir is bound on land at the edge of the habitable world, waiting to run. Jormungandr is beneath the sea, encircling Midgard, waiting to rise. And Hel is below everything, in the deepest and most northward place the Norse world imagines, waiting with the accumulated weight of every death that was ever not a warrior's death, which is to say, waiting with nearly all of the dead there have ever been. When Ragnarok comes, the tradition says, all 3 will move at once, and the ship of the dead, Naglfar, made from the nail clippings and hair of the corpses of the departed, will sail from Hel's realm, carrying her accumulated population into the final conflict. But that is a story for another reach of the tradition, a place far downstream from this moment of quiet origin. Here, at the beginning of Hel's story, what matters is the figure herself, standing still, neither threatening nor welcoming, one side warm and ordinary, the color of any living hand held up to any ordinary light, the other side the deep blue-black of something that has known a cold that fire cannot reach. Her mother's name means grief. Her father is the great changer and transgressor of the Norse divine order. Her siblings are a wolf who will eat the sky and a serpent who encircles the world, and she is the one cast downward, not punished, not imprisoned, but placed, given responsibility, given a domain, given the enormous and permanent work of receiving what the world sends her. Every death that is not a death in battle, every quiet ending, every long illness, every body that wears out slowly under the pressure of years, every child, every elder, every craftsperson, every farmer, every person who died in bed or by the water's edge or in the grip of a fever, all of them going to her through the gate that shuts behind them into the gray light of the covered place. The name asterisk, Halja asterisk, the covered place, the hidden place. The verb asterisk, helan, asterisk, to cover. The sound of earth moved over something, the flat pressure of soil arranged carefully over a shape until the shape is no longer visible from above, until there is only the smooth surface of the ground, and beneath it the concealed thing, which is not gone, which is not destroyed, which is simply covered, hidden, belonging now to the world below the surface, where the name of the ruler and the name of the realm are the same word, and the ruler stands in the gray light with her two-toned body receiving what is sent to her. The word is both a person and a place, a name that is also an address, a figure who is also a country, vast and cold, and older than the gods who sent her there, or at least that is how the tradition comes to feel when you sit with it long enough in the dark, that hell the place was always already there, waiting beneath the world, and hell the figure was simply the name the gods put on the thing that had always been waiting. She does not speak in Snorri's account of her establishment. She does not object or accept. She simply goes where she is directed, and the place becomes hers, and her name and the name of the place fold together into the same sound, and the sound settles into the world like something finding the exact shape of the space it was made to fill. Her siblings were cast outward, into binding, into the sea. She was cast inward and downward, which is a different kind of direction. Outward is away, downward is into the earth, into the mist, into the northward and subterranean root of things, the place where the oldest layers of the world are waiting beneath all the layers that came after, the place that was there, in some sense before much else was there, because Niflheim, the realm of mist and cold to which hell was sent, is one of the two primordial conditions of the Norse cosmological beginning, one of the two things that existed before the gods made the world out of the body of the first giant. The cold and the dark were there before the world, and hell was sent into them and made them her domain. There is a quality of stillness in the image that the tradition offers of her establishment. Not a dramatic quality, not a triumphant quality, simply the particular stillness of something that has found its place and does not need to move from it. She is there. The dead come, she receives them, the gate closes, the gray light continues. The hall called Eljugnir, sleet cold, damp with the cold of wet weather, holds its population of the quietly departed, and hell moves through it, or presides over it, or simply exists within it, with the same two-toned body and the same downcast or severe, or simply still expression that Snorri describes, the expression of someone whose work is never done and who does not find that disturbing. What Snorri gives us in his description of hell, taken in full, is a figure who has been given enormous responsibility without being made terrible by it, who governs an enormous population without being described as tyrannical or cruel or even particularly active. She is a ruler in the oldest and simplest sense. She holds the domain. She receives what enters it. She makes the determinations that are required of her when those determinations are required. The tradition does not describe her as suffering from her position or as having been wronged by it. It describes her as occupying it, inhabiting it, the way the covered place itself occupies the space beneath all the other spaces. And her body is the most honest thing about her. One side, the color of living warmth, one side, the color of permanent cold. Not a mask, not a disguise, not a dramatic costume of authority, simply the truth of what she is, written in the two colors of her skin, observable from a middle distance by anyone who stands in the gray light of that realm and looks at her clearly. The tradition's oldest sources do not describe her as cruel. They do not describe her as kind. They describe her as a ruler who has standards, who applies them consistently, who neither refuses arbitrarily nor accepts arbitrarily, whose decisions when she makes them carry a weight, not of malice, but of principle, the principle of someone who governs by the nature of things rather than by preference or feeling. She is perhaps the most consistent figure in the Norse divine structure in this sense. The other gods quarrel and are moved by pride and desire and affection and grief. Hell appears to be moved by none of these things, or moved only by them, insofar as they coincide with the requirements of her role. She stands in the gray light with her two halves precisely divided, and her expression that is neither welcoming nor refusing, and the world above her, Midgard, Asgard, Jotunheim, all the interconnected realms of the Norse cosmological tree, goes about its noisy and complicated business of conflict and creation and transformation, and below all of it she waits and receives, and the covered place grows slowly fuller with every generation that passes, and her name is both the name of the ruler and the name of the realm, and both have always been there, beneath everything. The Proto-Germanic root, asterisk halya, asterisk, the covered place, the hidden place, the place that is named for the act of covering, the act of drawing earth or stone or cold air over something until it disappears from the surface of the world and exists only in the depth beneath. When the Norse tradition speaks of the dead going to hell, what is said in a single syllable is not a sentence of punishment. It is a description of a direction, downward, into the covered place, into the realm that shares its name with the quiet and blue-black figure who stands at its center in the gray light, her warm side and her cold side both simply present, both simply what they are, the boundary made into a form, and the form given a name, and the name settled into the world with the particular weight of something that has always been there beneath everything, waiting patiently. Hiliat, the cold comes before anything else. Not the sharp cold of a winter morning when frost has settled on the ground and the air bites the skin and then releases, but a different kind entirely, the cold of a place that has never been warm, that holds no memory of warmth, that does not miss it. This is the cold of Niflheim, the mist home, the world of perpetual fog, and it arrives in the body, not as a sensation, but as a recognition, the way a sleeper recognizes the temperature of deep night, even without waking. The fog here is not weather. It does not roll in from elsewhere and will not lift when the light changes, because the light does not change in Niflheim, because no sun has ever reached this far north, this far down, this deep into the roots of the worlds. Niflheim is one of the two original conditions of existence in the Norse understanding of how things came to be. Before Yggdrasil grew, before the 9 worlds took their particular shapes along its branches and roots before the first cow licked the first salt from the first ice, and the first giant emerged from the thaw, there was already Niflheim, already cold, already dark, already full of the particular gray that is not night and not day, but something older than either. The tradition holds that this realm existed at the northern extreme of the void called Ginnungagap, across from the realm of fire Muspelheim, in the south, and that the meeting of those two extremes, ice and fire, cold and heat, contraction and expansion, was the condition that made creation possible. Niflheim is not, then, the underworld made later for a specific purpose. It is more fundamental than that. It is what was there first. The underworld that bears a related name, the realm assigned to hell, was built into a space that already existed, that already had its character, that was already old when the gods were young. The fog of Niflheim moves. That is the first thing to understand about it as a physical atmosphere. It is not static, not a wall, not a simple obscuration. It drifts, thickens, thins in places, closes again. Walking through it, a traveler would not be blind, but would see only the nearest few feet of ground with any clarity, and then shapes at the middle distance that could be stone, or could be ice, or could be nothing identifiable, and then beyond that, simply gray. The cold of the fog is damp, not the dry cold of high altitudes and clear air, but the cold of a stone wall that has been wet for so long it no longer remembers being dry, the cold of water that has been still so long it has grown heavy with itself. The ground underfoot in Niflheim, where there is ground, is stone, dark basalt or something older, worn smooth in some places and rough in others, with patches of ice that do not melt because nothing here is ever warm enough to melt them. The air smells of stone and cold water and nothing living. It does not smell of decay. It does not smell of anything that once was alive and is no longer. It smells simply of the deep earth, of the interior of a cave that goes far enough back that the entrance behind cannot be heard, of wet rock and cold air, and the particular mineral silence of a world that has been here since before life was invented. In the oldest layers of the Norse account, Niflheim and the realm called Hel are related but not identical. Niflheim is the ancient mist world, the original northern darkness. The realm ruled by Hel, sometimes called Niflhel, in sources that distinguish between the two, was established within it, or below it, when Odin assigned the daughter of Loki her dominion. What the two share is character, the cold, the mist, the downward direction, the sense of removal from everything above. What they might be said to differ in is age. Niflheim is as old as the void. The realm of Hel was made afterward, when there was someone to rule it and dead to fill it. The distinction matters less than the continuity, because the realm Hel governs, carries within it the character of the older place it was built into. The way a hall built on ancient stone carries that stone's coldness upward through its floor. Beneath the deepest root of Yggdrasil, in the dark of Niflheim's floor, the well called Hvergelmir sits. The name carries the meaning of something like the bubbling cauldron or the roaring kettle, a name that describes motion, sound, energy, which makes it an unusual thing to find in a world otherwise defined by stillness and silence. The Prose Edda holds that from Hvergelmir flow all the rivers of the nine worlds, or perhaps all the rivers of the nine worlds ultimately return to it. The language of the sources allowing for both directions, because this well is at once an origin and a terminus, the source of waters and the place to which waters eventually come back. The rivers it produces have names, a great many of them, enough that listing them feels less like listing rivers and more like listing a language. Svol and Gunthra, Fjorm and Fimbultul, Slither and Hrith, Silger and Ylger, Vith and Leiptr, and finally Gjol, the one that matters most for anyone moving toward the realm of the dead, the one that forms its border. All of these rivers begin in the dark, begin in the cold, begin beneath the deep root of the cosmic tree, and travel outward from there through all the worlds, carrying the water of Niflheim into everything else. The well of Hvergelmir, sitting beneath that root in the darkest place, does not look like a center of anything. Nothing about its appearance would suggest that from it the waters of all creation flow. It is a well in dark stone, its surface black and still, except where the springs below feed it and set it barely moving, a slight motion, barely perceptible, like breathing. The darkness around it is absolute. The root of Yggdrasil rises above it, vast and ancient, its surface rough and cold and faintly damp. The wood so old it has become more like stone than wood, its texture closer to the walls of a cave than to any tree. The well sits there in the dark, feeding the rivers that feed the worlds, and nothing marks it as exceptional. In the tradition, it simply is. It has always been there. It will be there after Ragnarok, when the seas rise and fall back, and the new earth appears. The waters will still run from it. The root of the tree, or whatever root remains, or whatever new tree grows, will still reach down into this dark and cold. Some things in the Norse account of the worlds are there before the story begins, and will still be there when the story ends, and the well in the dark is one of them. From Hövergolmir, moving outward through Niflheim, following the coldest and most distant of all the rivers that flow from it, a traveler who knew the way would eventually reach Gjell. The name means something like the loud noise or the roaring, and the river earns it. In the Prose Edda's account of Hermodr's ride to Hell, the journey made to petition for the return of Baldur, Gjell appears as the river immediately adjacent to the gate of Hell's realm, the boundary that separates the territory of the living from the territory of the dead. The bridge that crosses it is named Gjallar Bru, the Bridge of Gjoll, or the Roaring Bridge, and it is covered with glittering gold in some accounts, a detail that makes it strange against the surrounding gray. The sound of the river can be heard from a distance. That is the first sign that the gate is near, not a visual landmark but an auditory one, the roaring of water coming through the fog before any shape appears, growing louder as the road descends, until the bridge becomes visible. The bridge itself is not large, or rather it is not described with the kind of grandeur that might be expected of a threshold between the living and the dead. In the account of Hermod's crossing, it is simply there, a bridge, planked, spanning the roaring water, with a keeper at its near end. The keeper's name is Muthgwol, and she is described as a young woman, a detail that is not explained and not required to be. She stands at the near end of the bridge, as she always does, watching the road. When Hermod arrived, she told him that he was not the only rider who had recently passed her way, that Baldur had already crossed, and others with him, and that Hermod's footfall on the bridge sounded different from the dead, heavier with the life still in him, louder against the planking than a shade would make. She said this without alarm, simply as an observation, the way someone stationed at a particular post says what they see. Then she directed him further, downward and northward, past Helgrind, and into the domain of the dead. The exchange between Hermodr and Muthgwol is brief in Snorri's account. No ceremony, no riddles or trials, no list of requirements met before passage is granted. Muthgwol is not a guardian who can be bargained with, or a judge who weighs what the traveler has done. She is a record keeper, or perhaps something like a ferryman in function without being one in form. She marks who passes, in which direction, with how much life still in them. When she has said what she has to say, the crossing can begin. The far bank of Gjoll is colder than the near one, not dramatically colder, not the sudden plunge of a different climate, but the particular incremental decrease of temperature that comes with moving deeper into a place that has no source of heat, that has been cold so long the cold has settled into the ground and the air and the stone. On the far side of the bridge, Niflheim is a fraction more itself, a fraction more still, a fraction quieter. The sound of the roaring river fades behind, and the road continues. Helvgr, the way of hell, the road to hell. In the Norse account it has a name, the way rivers and bridges and gates have names, because it is a real route traveled by real dead on their way to a real place, or real in the sense that the tradition insisted on its reality, believed in its specific geography, built from it a coherent picture of where the dead go and what path brings them there. The road is described across various sources as leading consistently in two directions, downward and northward. These are not arbitrary coordinates. In the Norse cosmological orientation, north carried specific connotations that south did not: remoteness, cold, darkness, the direction from which winter comes and from which no warmth arrives. Down is the direction of burial, of the grave, of the earth's interior where the dead were placed and covered. Helvger goes both ways at once, into the earth and toward the north, the angle of its descent taking the traveler through terrain that becomes progressively less lit, less warm, less inhabited by anything with breath in it. The road is worn smooth. That is what long use does, and Helvger, in the Norse account of the worlds, has been in use since the first person died, of the first illness, or the first cold winter, or the first accident in the first age of the world. The surfaces most used by feet are the places where the stone wears first to smoothness, and then, over time enough, to a kind of polish. The way the center of a stone step on an ancient staircase becomes lower than its edges, pressed down by generation after generation of weight passing over it. Helvger, if the tradition's picture of it is followed to its physical implication, would be worn like that, not eroded, not broken, but compressed and polished by the passage of innumerable feet, all of them traveling in the same direction, none of them ever returning. The road goes only one way. Whatever is carried along, it is not retrieved. The fog thickens as Helvger descends. This is partly a matter of direction. The further into Niflheim, the denser the mist, but it also functions in the tradition as a kind of gradual veiling, the living world becoming less and less visible, the familiar shapes of existence fading out behind the traveler before anything in the new landscape resolves into visibility ahead. The Norse sources do not describe Helvger as frightening. The sagas that refer to it do so with the same matter-of-fact quality applied to actual roads. It is a route, it has a direction, it leads somewhere. Characters in the sagas speak of dying as taking the road to hell, or of waiting until they must travel it, with the same register they might use for a journey to another part of the country, an inevitable journey, a long one that others have already made and will be made by many more. The road is not the destination, it is the distance between here and there, walked through fog and cold and darkness, with the sound of the living world growing quieter behind, with every step. Along the way, and the way is long, described across Old Norse sources as a journey of multiple days, 9 nights in the account of Hermother's Ride. The road passes through valleys whose names are not given, valleys that are dark in the way that deep valleys and high mountains are dark even in daytime because the sun cannot reach their floors. In the account of Hermother's journey, the 9 nights of riding through dark valleys are presented without elaboration, simply as the duration and character of the road, the given physical reality of traveling from the world of the living to the world of the dead. 9 nights is a significant number in Norse tradition. Odin hung on Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain the runes. The worlds are 9 in number. The 9 nights of Helveg are not a random figure. They situate the journey within the cosmological order, make it proportionate to the scale of what is being crossed. This is not a short crossing. The distance between life and death, in the Norse account, is measured in cold and dark and time, and the measurement is long. The valleys of Helvur are without sound except for the traveler's own passage through them. The sound of Sleipnir's 8 hooves in Hermother's account, or in other cases, simply the sound of a person walking, feet on stone, breath in cold air. The quiet of those valleys is not the comfortable quiet of a room at night, or the restful quiet of a still landscape in the early morning. It is the quiet of a place from which certain types of sound have been absent for so long that the air itself has settled into the expectation of silence, the way a room long uninhabited feels different from a room where someone simply stepped out, not empty of presence. empty of the particular sounds that living things make, without being aware they are making them, the small continuous adjustments of breath and movement and warmth that fill the air around a living body. That kind of sound is not present in the valleys of Helvegar. The only sound in those valleys is whatever the traveler brings with them, and even that grows quieter as the road goes on, muffled by fog and stone and the weight of the air. Grinpelhillir, the cave at the cliff, the tradition places it at the entrance to Hell's realm, the particular feature of the landscape in which Garmr stands watch. The Völuspá names Garmr as standing before Grinpelhillir, a hound described as blood-stained, howling, and bound. Bound now, with the implication that the binding will fail at Ragnarök, when Garmr and the god Tyr will meet in the final battle, and neither will survive the encounter. In the present age of the world, Garmr is at the cave, and the cave is at the threshold. The wishowling of Garmr, in the Völuspá's enumeration of the signs of the end of things, is listed among the events that will herald Ragnarök, which means that in the ordinary run of time, before those events begin, Garmr does not howl. The hound is there, at the cave, before the gate. But the howl is not yet. The tradition holds the howl in reserve for the end, and in the meantime there is the cave, and the cold, and the hound present without that particular sound, simply a figure in the dark at the entrance to something much larger than the entrance suggests. The gate itself is named Helgrind. The name means the bars of hell, or the gate of hell, the word grind referring to the bars or the grating that makes a gate more than a door, that makes it a barrier with visible structure rather than a simple closed surface. Helgrind, in the account of Hermother's approach, is a physical object he needed to pass, and he passed it by urging Sleipnir into a leap over it, rather than by passing through it, a detail that preserves the gate's integrity even in the one account of a living being's entry into Hell's realm. Helgrind does not open for the living, or rather, the tradition does not show it opening for the living. The dead do not need a gate to open in the way a living person needs a door. The dead arrive, and the realm receives them. Helgrind is more properly a gate for the living, a barrier against return, because what it controls is not the flow of the dead into the realm, but the movement of anything back out of it. The scale of Helgrind is not given precisely in the sources. What the name implies, and what the account of Hermiter's leap confirms, is that it is a substantial structure, tall enough that clearing it required the extraordinary horse, Sleipnir, Odin's own eight-legged mount, who in the tradition is the fastest and most capable of horses, able to carry a rider through any terrain and across any boundary. That Hermodmer had to take the gate at a leap, rather than face it as a door, is a detail that speaks to its height. The gate is not meant to be easily cleared. Its bars are not spaced for climbing. The stone or iron of its construction sits in its frame with the settled weight of something built to last for as long as the current order of the worlds lasts, which in the Norse account means until Ragnarök. After that, the sources do not specify what happens to Helgrind when the worlds end and reform. The gate, like many specific objects of the tradition, belongs to this age of the world. What the next age will need is a different question. Beyond Helgrind, the road continues, or rather, the road ends, and the territory of the realm begins. Though even inside the realm, there are paths, ways between one part of it and another, a kind of internal geography that is in some sense an extension of the road that led here. The realm of Hell, as the tradition pictures it, is not a single undifferentiated space, but a place with a layout, with a hall at its center, and areas around the hall, with distances that have to be crossed between one point and another. Hermodr, after crossing Gjallarbru and clearing Helgrind, still had to travel to the hall before he reached Hel herself. The realm has an interior, it has depth. It is not a threshold, but a country, cold and mist-wrapped and vast in its own way, holding within it the accumulated dead of all the ages that have passed since the first person ever died and made their way down Helveg. The cold of Helveg realm is the same cold as the cold outside it, the cold of Niflheim, but with one addition. Here the cold has walls, or not walls exactly, but edges, the sense that the cold is not traveling outward from a center or drifting in from elsewhere, but is simply the temperature of this particular enclosed space, stable and complete. A cold that is the same near the ceiling as near the floor, the same in the center of an open space as in a corner, because nothing here generates heat, and nothing here moves fast enough to shift the air into anything like warmth. The light in Hel's realm, where there is any, is gray-white, the same gray as the fog outside, with no direction to it, no suggestion of a source, no shadow. Objects in this light are visible, but without depth, their surfaces evenly illuminated by something that does not cast. It is the light of a deeply overcast winter day, when the sun is not visible and has not been visible for so long that its direction cannot even be guessed. The flat, sourceless light that makes everything look slightly more like itself in outline and slightly less like itself in texture. In the fog at the road's end, before Helgrind, the way Helvegr delivers its travelers can be understood as a kind of gradual preparation. The 9 nights of dark valleys, the cold increasing by increments, the sound of the roaring river marking the approach of the border, the bridge and its keeper, and then the gate. Each feature of the journey is a step further from the warmth and sound and light of the world above, each one conditioning the traveler for what comes next, so that by the time Helgrind is reached, the sharp distinction between the living world and the dead one has already been softened by the distance traveled through the middle territory of the road. The Norse tradition does not describe this preparation as a kindness or as a design. It simply describes the geography, and the geography happens to work this way, the way a road that descends gradually prepares the legs for the terrain below, better than one that drops suddenly. The earth above Niflheim, the 9 worlds on their levels, the living beings moving through them, the gods in Asgarth, the men in Midgard, the giants in their far reaches, those worlds do not know they are above Hel, or they know it the way people who live above underground rivers know the river is there without hearing it or seeing it, simply as a fact about the ground they walk on. Helveg is not visible from above. The road to Hel is not a feature of the landscape that living travelers encounter by accident. The dead find it, or it finds the dead, and the living who seek it deliberately must know what they are looking for. The tradition does not offer a precise location for Helvegr's northern entrance from the world above. It simply holds that the road is there, that it goes north and down, and that it has been traveled continuously since the first death in the first age of the world. The sound of the river Gjöll, roaring at the border of the realm, does not carry up through the 9 worlds to be heard by the living. The cold of Niflheim does not seep upward into Midgard through some geological connection. What is below is simply below, complete in itself, unhearing and unheard, as separate from the world of the living as depth is from surface. Gjöll is the boundary. Not Helgrind, not the cave of Gneipaheller, not the road's descent through its dark valleys. The river is the first real border, the one that Mothgwither watches, the one that roars audibly from a distance through the fog. Rivers have always served this function in the world's underworld traditions, and the Norse Gjoll does it with the same plainness it does everything else. It roars, it is wide, it runs fast, and it is cold in the particular way that water is cold, when it has come from somewhere deep in the earth and has never been touched by sun. The gold of the bridge Galar Brew, where it appears in the accounts, is the one warm color in this entire landscape, and it is not warm from any internal quality, only from the memory of warmth, the way gold carries the suggestion of firelight, even in the dark. The bridge sits over the roaring water, quiet against its sound, connecting the near bank to the far one, and at its foot Mothguthr stands in the gray light, watching the road as she has always been watching. Crossing the bridge takes a moment, a brief suspension over the sound of the water, the planking underfoot, the far bank coming into view through the fog, and then the far side, colder, quieter, the roaring of Gjoll behind now, the silence of the realm ahead. The road continues. It is the same road it has always been, stone, smooth, worn, going north and down into the gray. The gate will be visible eventually, after the road descends a little further, after the fog shows the dark shape of Helgrind against its gray-white background, massive and still, the hound at the cave to the gate's side, the bars of the gate in their frame, and beyond the gate, the realm stretching away into a cold interior, the hall at its center, and all of Hell's domain spreading outward from that central structure in all directions to whatever distances the mist obscures. The road to Hell is not the end of anything, or not only the end, it is also the approach, the path that arrives somewhere, that crosses a roaring river and clears a great gate and delivers its travelers into a place with geography and a ruler and a name, Helvgarn northward and downward, smoothed by the feet of the uncountable dead across the unimaginable span of all the ages, continues past the gate with no visible terminus, no point at which the mist parts to reveal the full extent of where the road has gone. It simply goes on into the gray-white interior of the realm, the fog closing behind each traveler as they pass through it, the road beneath them as worn and as cold and as unhurried as it has always been, vanishing northward into the mist dark with all the quiet patience of a distance that has never needed to announce itself because it has always simply been there and always will be. The walls of Eleuthir do not announce themselves. They rise from the cold ground of the realm in which they stand without ornament, without the warm light that might spill from under a door or glimmer at the edge of a window, without any of the domestic signals that tell a traveler they are approaching a place where someone is comfortable and expecting company. The exterior presents itself the way very old stone presents itself, simply there, dark with the particular dampness that belongs to air that never fully dries, its surface carrying the faint sound of cold weather moving against it. There is something of sleet in that sound, not the dramatic percussion of a true storm, but the quieter, more persistent sound of fine wet precipitation against a dark wall at a late hour, the kind of sound that belongs to the deep part of a night that will not be warm again for a long time. The hall stands, the cold moves against it. The air around it is not still. It carries that soft, continuous noise of weather, of moisture, of a climate that has no interest in comfort, and no particular malice either, only its own steady, indifferent character. The name of the hall is Eleuthir. Scholars working in Old Norse have read it as meaning something in the range of sleet cold, or damp with the cold of rain, or more fully the misery that belongs to cold, wet weather, the specific discomfort of driving sleet, the kind that finds the gaps in clothing and does not stop. The name is built from elements related to that particular meteorological fact, and in being named for it, the hall is described before any interior is opened. A hall whose name means sleet cold tells something important about itself before anyone steps inside. The outside and the inside are made of the same material. The cold is not what the hall keeps out. The cold is what the hall is. There is a kind of honesty in that. A hall that is warmed against the weather pretends, in a small way, that the weather is an inconvenience to be overcome, something that exists at the door but need not come in. Eiluthnir makes no such pretense. What the air outside contains, the air inside carries also. The dampness that moves against the exterior walls is present in the interior as well. Low and steady, the way cold always finds the lowest point of any enclosed space and settles there. The smell of the hall, if one were to stand at its threshold and draw a breath, would be the smell of cold stone and the particular earthen damp of a place built where no sun has warmed the ground in a very long time. Not unclean, simply cold, simply the atmosphere of a place that was named for exactly this, down to the word, and has never seen any reason to be otherwise. Before the door opens, one last detail of the exterior deserves a moment of attention. The hall is large, whatever one might imagine as the dimensions appropriate to a hall that receives the overwhelming majority of all the dead from all the 9 worlds. The hall must be imagined as equal to that number. There is no account in the old sources that describes Eiluthnir as cramped or overflowing, as a place strained by its population. The Norse tradition gives it the quality of adequacy, not abundance, not luxury, but the specific quality of a space that is sufficient for what it contains, a hall that has always been large enough, a hall whose proportions were set before anyone arrived and have not needed adjustment since. Standing outside it, looking at the long line of its roof against the gray dark above, the size of it registers not as oppressive, but as simply commensurate with what it holds, the way the sky is commensurate with the weather it carries. Inside, and moving slowly, because the interior of Eiluthnir is a place whose details ask to be approached without hurry. The first thing the prose Edda gives a name to is the bed. This is not the bed of an occupant who is resting temporarily and will rise in the morning. It is the bed of the hall itself, a specific piece of furniture within the Hall of the Dead, named in Snorri Sturluson's inventory of the place as kor. The Old Norse word kor means sickness. More specifically, it means the sick bed, the bed one occupies during illness, not the bed of ordinary nightly rest, but the bed that becomes one's world during the decline that precedes dying. To name the bed in a Hall of the Dead kor is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of accurate memory. The bed remembers what brought its occupants here. It holds in its name the reason they are lying in it now, in this particular hall, and not another, in this cold, quiet place, rather than somewhere else. Kor stands in the interior of Eiluthnir as a specific and serious object. Its form in the old sources is not described in detail. The name is what the tradition preserves, not the construction of the thing, but the name is enough to make it felt. A bed called sickness has a weight to it that a merely comfortable piece of furniture does not carry. One can sit with the image of it in the middle of the hall's cold interior and understand what it is doing there, holding in a single word the long history of everyone who has ever arrived at this threshold. Having spent their final weeks in something very much like this, a body surrendering to what it could not recover from, the illness present in the bed, the way the cold is present in the walls, simply and entirely and without apology. The Old Norse sources place Hell's realm within a tradition that includes the full range of those who die outside of battle, the sick, the aged, those whose bodies gave out, in one of the countless ordinary ways that bodies give out across the span of a human life. The bed, named core, is the furniture of that particular end, not the dramatic finality of the battlefield, not the swift decisive thing, but the slower one, the illness that takes weeks, the fever that comes and does not break, the long winter that settles in the lungs and does not lift until everything else has lifted first. Core names all of that. One word for a whole long category of human experience, and then a bed placed at the center of a cold hall so that the name and the object together can hold what they know. The hall's interior continues, moving from the bed toward a table, or what the tradition implies exists there. Since furnishings are named rather than architecturally arranged in Snorri's account, the next object is a dish. Its name is hunger. In Old Norse, hunger means hunger. The dish belonging to Hel's Hall is named for the state of not being filled, of wanting food and not receiving it, of an emptiness that persists. A dish named hunger is in the most immediate reading an empty dish. It is an object whose purpose is to receive food, and whose name describes the absence of food. Placed at the table of a hall in a cold realm under the earth, named for the thing it cannot provide, the dish called hunger contributes something specific to the atmosphere of Eljuthnir. Not torture, not punishment, deprivation. The quiet, ongoing fact of an absence that does not resolve. This puts Eljuthnir in an interesting relation to other underworld traditions. The hall is not a place of torment in any active sense. No source describes its occupants as suffering in the manner that some other traditions describe their underworlds. The closest comparison the tradition offers, and scholars have noted this, is something like the Greek understanding of the Asphodel Meadows, the gray and joyless middle country of the dead, who were neither heroic enough for Elysium nor wicked enough for Tartarus. The majority of the dead in that tradition spent their afterlife in a place that was characterized primarily by the absence of what made life vivid, not by any specific affliction, but by a kind of reduction. Eljuthnir carries a similar quality. The dish named hunger does not suggest that the dead are tormented by starvation. It suggests that the hall is defined by what it lacks, that its furnishings have absorbed the names of the diminishments that led to death, and continue to carry those names quietly in the cold interior, without drama. The dish rests on whatever surface holds it. Its interior is empty or appears so. The name is on it in the way names are on objects that have always had them, as though hunger and the dish were the same thing from the beginning, and it would not be possible to speak of one without the other. And beside it on the table lies the knife. The knife in Hel's Hall is named Soltrik. Soltrik in Old Norse means famine. It is the deeper word for the absence of food, not the daily hunger of an unfilled dish, but the prolonged structural deprivation that defines famine, the absence of sustenance over time and across scale. A knife named famine is an instrument for preparing a meal that is never prepared, a tool for cutting food that does not exist, lying beside a dish named hunger on a table that holds nothing. The combination of the three words, hunger, soldier, core, produces a particular kind of picture. These are not the words of a place where something terrible is happening. They are the words of a place where something is steadily, quietly not happening. The meal is not made. The dish is not filled. The bed is occupied, not in health, but in the long diminishment of illness. Snorri Sturluson gathered these names from material that came to him out of an older tradition, and in naming the furnishings of Hel's Hall, he was doing something that the tradition had always done with the objects in sacred or significant spaces, allowing the name of the thing to carry the meaning of the thing, so that the object and its significance were inseparable. A sword has its name, a ship has its name. The Hall of the Dead has names for its bed, its dish, its knife, its threshold. Each name is a compressed account of something. Each name, spoken or read, releases what it contains into the air of the room where it sits. Kor, hunger, solter, for sickness, hunger, famine, three quiet words for three ordinary objects in a cold hall, and together they describe the kind of dying they were made to remember. It is worth sitting with the coherence of these names. As a set, they do not arrive at random. They form a cluster around a particular theme: the decline of the body through deprivation and illness, the slow failure of the physical self. Kor names the bed where the failing body spent its last days. Hunger names the empty vessel, the body's need that could not be met. Soldier names the deeper absence behind the hunger, the condition of a world that could not provide what the body required to continue. Together they trace a path, illness to want of famine, the progressive narrowing of a life toward its end. And the hall in which they sit is named for the cold, wet weather that is their shared climate, the sleet cold of Yggdrasil, the appropriate atmosphere for a place that holds these things. Hail, in the old sources, is not a figure who inflicts suffering on the dead who come to her hall. She rules them as a domain, she governs the realm, but the character of the place is not defined by anything she does to its population. The hall's furnishings carry their difficult names as features of the architecture, not as instruments of punishment. This is a distinction the tradition seems to hold carefully. The hall is not a place of torment, it is a place of permanent and quiet reduction, defined by the names of what is absent. Forflive, and hell over it all, described in the Prosetta as an administrator, a ruler, a figure who presides over what she has been given dominion over, the ordinary dead, the overwhelming number, those who came to their end in the long ordinary ways that life ends. There is something in the arrangement of these objects, bed, dish, knife, all of them named, all of them sitting in their places in the cold interior of the hall, that resembles the care of a museum. Not in any formal sense, but in the sense that a museum takes an object from its original context and places it in a space where it can be examined, and attaches to it a label that explains what it is and what it meant, when in doing so preserves both the object and its significance across a span of time far longer than either was meant to last. The furnishings of Yggdrasil have their labels. The tradition attached the names to the objects, and in doing so made them available for exactly this kind of slow examination. A person in the dark, centuries and centuries after the stories were last told, in the context in which they were made, reading the label on the bed that says Kor, and understanding not just the word, but the whole long weight of what it remembers. The interior of the hall extends beyond these named objects. The cold runs evenly through it. The sound of sleet against the exterior walls is audible from within, faint and continuous, the background note of Yggdrasil's permanent climate. There is no hearth described, no fire mentioned in the accounts of the hall's contents. This is consistent with the hall's logic. A hall named Sleet Cold, and furnished with objects named for hunger and famine, is not a hall that contains the relief of fire. The warmth that fire would provide would be a contradiction of everything the hall is. Yggdrasil holds its cold, the way it holds its names, completely and without effort, simply because this is what it is. And at its far end, or perhaps at its entrance, The spatial arrangement of the hall is not laid out with architectural precision in the old sources, only its contents are named. There is one more named thing, the threshold. The threshold of Eldjuthnir carries the name Falandaforath. It is a compound word in Old Norse, and its elements come together to mean the falling danger, or the stumbling block, or more precisely the hazard of a fall. Falanda Forad names the threshold of the Hall of the Dead as the place of falling, not the fall that comes after death, but the fall that precedes it, the stumble that signals the body's final failure of coordination, the collapse that arrives when the body can no longer manage the basic negotiation between a human being and the surface they are standing on. The threshold is named for this. The point of entry into Eldjuthnir carries in its name the moment of going down, the last fall, the one that happens on the floor of a room or at the edge of a bed, the fall that announces that the slow process of illness or age has reached its furthest point. A raised stone sill, worn smooth at its center. The smoothness at the center is the result of use, of feet crossing over it in enormous numbers across an enormous span of time, each crossing pressing slightly into the stone, the aggregate of all those crossings, eventually polishing the surface to the texture of old water-worn rock. The stone of the threshold knows exactly how many people have passed over it. The number is too large for any naming, but the stone holds it in the smoothness of its surface, in the particular way a stone worn by long use holds the evidence of everything it has been used for, not as a record that can be read, but as a fact that can be felt underfoot. Falanda Forath names the fall. The fall that brought the person to this threshold is already behind them when they cross it. It happened in the world above, in a room in a longhouse, or beside a river, or in a field where the body simply stopped and went down. But the threshold carries the name of that fall as a memorial, the way the bed carries the name of sickness and the dish carries the name of hunger. The architecture of Eldjuthnir is a kind of monument built from names. Each named element holds one aspect of the long, slow way that people come to arrive here, and together they form a complete account. The illness, the hunger that accompanied it or preceded it, the famine that was the condition of an entire life, and then the final fall, and then the threshold, named for that fall, worn smooth by the feet of everyone who has crossed it. There is a quality to the naming of Falandaforath that the other names in Eldjuthnir share, but that the threshold makes most vivid, because the threshold is the architectural element through which arrivals pass. It is the seam between the outside and the inside, the point where someone who has come down the long road in the cold finally arrives at the hall and crosses into it. Every person who has ever entered Eldjuthnir has crossed that threshold. Every foot that has stepped over it has left some infinitesimal impression on the stone. The name Falandaforath means that every one of those crossings is in the name itself remembered, not individually. The name does not hold individual names. It holds the type, the category, the shared nature of the experience. Falling as the characteristic last movement of a body that has been declining, the specific helplessness of a fall that the body cannot prevent. To see this threshold from the inside is a slightly different experience than seeing it from the outside. From outside, the threshold is a barrier to cross, a point of arrival, the last step before the cold hall receives its new arrival. From inside, standing in the hall and looking back at the threshold, the fall is already complete. The crossing is behind the person who has just made it. The name Falandaforath, seen from the inside, names something that has already happened to the person reading it. Their fall, their particular and specific fall, is the reason they are standing in this hall, looking back at the stone. The threshold is simultaneously the name of the fall and the proof that the fall was survived in the only way such falls can be survived, by passing through and arriving somewhere quiet and cold and permanent. The hall receives. That is the consistent quality of Eleuthir, as the tradition describes it. It does not pursue. It does not summon in the active way of some underworld traditions, where the dead are drawn down by specific mechanisms, by judgment or by the weight of their deeds, by particular gods who reach up from the dark and pull. Eleuthir simply receives. The dead come because this is where the long road leads, because the cold north and the way down through the earth both terminate here, and when they arrive, the hall is already as it was, its furnishings already named, its temperature already established, its threshold already worn smooth and waiting for one more person to cross it. The bed called Kor will accommodate another body. The dish named Hunger will sit empty on the table. The knife named Solter will lie beside it, its blade clean and still, waiting to perform work that does not arrive. And the hall around all of these objects will continue to be exactly what its name describes, the atmosphere of cold and wet, the persistence of sleet cold through all the hours, no change of weather possible, inside a place whose weather is fixed into its name and has been since the beginning of whatever it means for a hall like this one to have had a beginning. The cold in the hall has a texture, not the sharp, biting cold of open, exposed weather, but the settled cold of enclosed spaces that have not been warmed in so long that the walls themselves are cold, that the stone of the floor carries it upward, that the air at the ceiling is no different from the air at the ground, because there is no source of heat to create the difference. This is the cold of Eleuthir, not dramatic, not violent, the persistent, even thorough cold of a place that was built at the bottom of a world that was already cold, under the earth where the sun's warmth does not penetrate, in the depths of a realm whose name means mist, and whose character is the character of the deep interior of the earth. Unchanged, unchanging, old. Old is the right word for Eleuthir, not ancient in a way that makes it strange or alarming, old in the way that very old things are old, in the way that a stone worn smooth by generations of feet is old, in the way that a word that has been spoken in the same form for 1,000 years is old. The hall has been receiving the dead since the Norse tradition imagined there were dead to receive. It predates every story told about it. It predates every person who has ever crossed Falandaforath. It was there before any of them, and it will be there, the tradition holds, until the long turning of the cosmos brings even Eleuthir to whatever transformation Ragnarok entails. And even in that transformation, the hall will have had a specific documented existence, its objects named, its atmosphere described, its threshold worn smooth and recorded. The three names of the hall's furnishings, Kor, Hunger, Soltra, form a set that is small enough to hold in the mind all at once. Sickness, hunger, famine, 3 words for 3 objects in one cold hall, each word carrying its own specific weight, and the 3 together forming a picture of the kind of dying they were meant to remember. This is not a comprehensive account of all the ways people have died and come to Hell's Hall. It is a representative set. The tradition chose these 3, grouped them with these names, placed them in this hall, and in doing so said something about the general character of the deaths that bring people here. Not the heroic deaths, not the swift ones, not the deaths that have drama and significance in the martial framework of Old Norse culture. Those deaths go elsewhere. The deaths that come to Eleuthir are the slow ones, the bed, the empty bowl, the failed harvest. the body that declined by degrees until the last degree was crossed, and then the threshold, fallanda forth, waiting with its name in place, worn smooth by the last steps of everyone who has ever passed over it. The fall is named, the crossing is made, and the hall receives as it always has, as it was made to do, with the cold steadiness of a place that has never been in any hurry and has never needed to be. The names themselves are worth returning to, because names in the Old Norse tradition are not decorative. When a sword is named, the name contains the sword's history and character. When a ship is named, the name holds what the ship is for. When Snorri Sturluson names the furnishings of Eljuthnir, and it is worth noting that this is the precision the tradition preserves, not a vague description of a dark hall, but specific objects with specific names. He is doing what the tradition does with all significant things. He is saying, this object has been known by this name, and the name tells you what the object is, and if you hold both the name and the object in your mind together, you will understand something that neither could tell you alone. Kor alone is a word for sickness. A bed alone is a piece of furniture. Kor is the name of the bed in the Hall of the Dead, is a third thing, both at once and more than either, a memorial piece of furniture, an object that carries its history in its name, sitting in a cold hall, telling everyone who enters what it remembers about them and the people who occupied it before them. Hungry alone is a word for hunger. A dish alone holds food. A dish named hunger in the Hall of the Dead is the specific named permanently present fact of the meal that could not be made, the body that could not be fed enough to continue, the slow failure of sustenance. The dish does not accuse anyone. It only holds its name in the cold air of the hall and continues to be empty. Sultra alone is a word for famine. A knife alone is a tool. A knife named Sultra lying beside the empty dish in the Hall of the Dead is the extended version of the same story. Not just an unfilled dish on one occasion, but the structural absence of food, the conditions that made the hunger inevitable, the social and ecological fact of a world that could not always provide what the bodies living in it required. And Philandaforeth, the threshold, not a word alone, not a raised stone sill alone, but the compound of both, the doorstep of the Hall of the Dead, that carries in its name every fall that ever brought someone to it, the specific characteristic movement of the end of a life that was declining, the last negotiation between a human body and the surface of the earth, the moment when the body lost that negotiation and went down and did not get up again. The hall holds all of this. Its name holds the weather, its furnishings hold the dying, its threshold holds the fall. Geljuthnir is a place whose every named element is a form of memory, a structure built from the specific experiences of everyone who has ever arrived here, compressed into a name and placed on an object and left in the cold to endure. Moving back through the interior of the hall, through the low, even cold, past the bed standing in its place, with its name carried quietly, past the table where the empty dish and the still knife sit beside each other in the gray interior light, moving back toward the threshold, back toward the point of entry, the point where the inside and the outside meet, and where the name of the fall is written into the stone. The threshold is more worn at its center than at its edges. This is always the way of a threshold that has seen long use. The middle is where the foot naturally falls as it crosses, and the stone at the center receives more pressure than the stone at the sides, and over time the center sinks slightly or polishes to a slightly different texture, carrying in its surface the evidence of use. At Philandaforeth, the center is very smooth. The use it represents is very long. The feet that have crossed this threshold are beyond any counting that would mean anything, and the stone knows it in the way stone knows, used through the slow yielding of its surface, the gradual polishing that happens over thousands of years, of thousands of feet, the almost imperceptible rounding of a stone's edge that comes from being crossed by an uncountable number of last steps. Each foot that crossed this threshold was the last foot its owner ever placed on a threshold. The fall that brought them here was their last fall. The crossing of Furet was the last crossing. The stone holds all of this in its smoothness, without drama, without marking the significance of any one crossing above any other. They are all equivalent at the threshold of Eluthnir. Every last step is a last step. Every fall is the final fall. The name holds them equally, and the stone holds them equally, and the hall behind the threshold holds everyone who has made that crossing equally in its cold and quiet interior. The sound of sleet against the exterior walls continues. It is not a new sound. It has always been there, a feature of the atmosphere of this place rather than a weather event happening to it, and it will continue for as long as Eluthnir stands, which by the logic of the tradition is for as long as the world, as the tradition describes it, continues to be the world. The cold will not change. The names on the furnishings will not change. The threshold will continue to be worn smooth at its center by the crossing of feet that have nowhere else to go, each one making its last step over the stone that remembers falling, entering the hall that is named for sleet and furnished with sickness and hunger and famine, finding the cold even and the space sufficient, and the hall already organized around the presence of everyone who has arrived before. Every footfall that crossed it was the last one someone ever took. The stone of Furet is smooth and cold and very old, and it holds that fact in its surface with the simple patience of stone, without judgment, without grief, without anything except the long-worn evidence of an accumulation that has never stopped and has nowhere it is trying to get to, only the continuing work of receiving what comes down the cold road from the world above, one last step at a time. A straw mattress in a Norse longhouse smells of dried grass and the particular sweetness of hay that has been slept on through many winters. It shifts and compresses under a body's weight. The stalks underneath the linen cover settle audibly, a dry whisper of movement, when someone rolls or adjusts or finally goes still. Outside, wind moves against the sod walls. The fire has burned low. The room is warm at the center and cold at the edges, and the quality of light is that specific amber gray of a room lit only by coals, where nothing is entirely bright and nothing is entirely dark, and the shapes of familiar things, a loom, a chest, a hanging cloak, are still present at the periphery, but have lost their daytime sharpness. This is where the concept the Old Norse sources describe as dying on the straw has its origin, not in abstraction, not in theology, in this room, in this specific quality of light, in the weight of a body that has gone as still as it is going to go. The distinction the Norse tradition drew between kinds of death was not merely poetic. It carried real weight in how a life was understood, how a death was remembered, and where, in the cosmological scheme the tradition maintained, the dead were understood to go afterward. To die in battle, weapon in hand, was to be eligible for something specific, a selection, a choosing. The Valkyries moved through fields of fallen men and made their choices, and those chosen went to Valhall, where they would eat and drink and fight again until the world ended and they were needed for something larger. This was a death available to a particular kind of person in a particular kind of circumstance. It was not available to everyone. It was not, by any fair accounting, available to most people. The overwhelming majority of Norse men and women across all the centuries the tradition spans, died of other things. They died of the fever that would not break in the third week of winter. They died of the wound that seemed small and then was not. They died of the lung sickness that crept in with the cold months and did not leave when the cold months did. They died of the gradual failure that comes with great age, the slow withdrawal of strength over years, the body settling toward stillness, the way a fire settles toward ash, not extinguished suddenly, but declining through stages until the last warmth is simply gone. They drowned in rivers and fjords. They fell from heights. They were taken by childbirth, by hunger in difficult years, by the accumulated weight of years of hard work in a hard climate. All of these deaths led to the same place, along the same road, through the same gate. The road to hell. Hellvegar, the way of hell, running downward and northward through valleys where no sun reached, received a far greater traffic than any battlefield. For every warrior chosen by a Valkyrie from the carnage of a raid, a dozen others were already making that slower journey through cold air and dark. Hell's Hall was, in the arithmetic of the Norse cosmos, the destination of almost everyone. This is not a detail the tradition treats as tragic. It is simply the shape of things, the structure of a cosmology in which one path was narrow and most other paths were wide, and the wide paths all converged on the same cold plane at the world's root. The Old Norse sagas, written down primarily in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, preserve a psychological record of how this distinction was experienced by the people who lived within it. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, one of the longest and most detailed of the Icelandic sagas, includes a figure, Egil himself in his old age, who has outlived his contemporaries, lost his sons, grown blind and frail, and sits near the fire with the sullen awareness that the death coming for him will not be the death he would have chosen. He describes in the poetry attributed to him the specific difficulty of this. The warrior's death was swift and recognized. The straw death arrived slowly, in a room, attended by those who loved you, or those paid to attend, and the gap between these two kinds of ending was not merely physical. It was a gap in meaning, a gap in the story that would be told afterward. The concept the tradition sometimes gestures toward, referred to in relation to the Old Norse term, nith, meaning social shame, unmanliness, the failure to meet a recognized standard of conduct, extended this gradation into the afterlife itself. Some sources suggest a moral layering within Hell's domain, a deepest stratum called Niflhel, distinguished from the broader realm, where those who died in disgrace were understood to descend. The tradition does not elaborate this geography in great detail. What it preserves is the outline of an idea that within the vast and quietly populated Hall of the Dead, gradations existed, and that the manner of a life and the manner of a death were not entirely forgotten when the person who had lived and died arrived at Eluthnir's threshold. This is not a framework of punishment in any simple sense. It is something more like the idea that a person carries who they were with them even after, and that who they were continues to matter, even in a place that holds everyone. The archaeology of Viking Age Scandinavia, spanning roughly from the late 8th century through the early 11th, offers a different kind of document than the sagas and the Eddic poems. It is a document written not in language but in objects, in what people chose to place in the ground beside those they were sending away. Excavations from burial sites throughout what is now Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland have revealed a practice of considerable care and specificity. The warrior burials are well known, ships and weapons, and the elaborate ceremonial staging of departure for those who had lived by the blade. Less famous, but no less numerous, are the graves of people who were not warriors, who were not jarls or kings, whose deaths arrived on straw, or in shallow water, or in the ordinary slow collapse of age. A woman's grave from the Viking Age, excavated from the soil of Scandinavia, might contain a spindle whorl, a small dense disk of fired clay or carved bone used to give weight and momentum to the thread being drawn from a distaff. It might contain a set of small iron weights for a balance scale, the working tools of someone who traded cloth or measured grain. It might contain a carved wooden comb with some of its teeth broken, a glass bead necklace, a brooch of silver or bronze pinned still in the position it would have occupied on the shoulder of a cloak. These are not ceremonial objects, they are the objects of a life. Someone chose them, gathered them, placed them with attention. The reasoning behind the choosing, whether it was intended to equip the dead for continued use of these things, or to signal to whatever received the dead who this person had been, and what kind of life they had led, is not written down. What is written down is the placement, the care, the specificity of selection. A child's grave sometimes contains miniature versions of adult tools, a tiny axe head, a small set of weights, a wooden toy shaped like an animal. The miniaturization is not reductive. It speaks to the same underlying thought that the dead person would continue to be who they had been, that the identity formed in a living life was not dissolved by dying, but carried forward. The child who had played with the small wooden horse would, in whatever understanding governed the placing of it there, have the small wooden horse. The woman who had spun and measured and traded would have her spindle and her weights. The man whose grave contained a set of carpenter's tools, a plane, an adze, and awl, had built things in his life, and whoever buried him believed, or hoped, or simply needed to believe, that building remained available to him. This is the population of Hell's Hall, not an abstraction. A craftsperson who shaped wood in a particular Norwegian valley in the year 900 and something. A woman who died of the fever in the second winter of her marriage, her spindle whorl placed beside her by someone who had watched her use it every evening for years. An old man whose grave contained a set of whalebone gaming pieces, smoothed by decades of handling, the largest of them worn where a thumb had settled into its curve again and again across the long evenings of a long life. Each of them crossing Galarbru, the roaring bridge, crossing the threshold Falandafordeth, stepping into the particular cold and quiet of Eleuthner and being received, the hall-making room. The hall unchanged and unhurried, as it had always been unchanged and unhurried, accommodating one more arrival in the endless sequence of arrivals that had been flowing toward it since the world's beginning. The Eddic poetry does not describe at length what happens inside the hall once the dead have arrived. This is worth holding. The sources that give the hall its name describe its furnishings, chart the road that leads to it. They are not concerned with the afterlife as a detailed continuation of the living world. They are concerned with the structure, the cosmological placement, the assignment of governance. What happens inside Eleuthner after someone has crossed its threshold is given much less attention than the hall's name, its objects' names, its position at the root of the world. What the tradition seems most interested in when it comes to Hell's realm is the fact of it, the existence of a place that receives the dead and holds them, administered by a figure of two-toned substance and quiet authority, surrounded by objects that name the manner of departure. There is an old woman, not named, not from a specific saga, but present in the composite picture of Norse daily life that the sagas collectively produce, who has lived a long life in a cold climate, raised children, lost some of them, watched the years change the shape of the land, in the shape of her own hands, and now lies on her straw mattress in the amber gray light of banked coals, breathing slowly the household quiet around her. She is not a warrior. She never was. The road to Valhall was not the road set for her life. The road set for her runs north and down, through valleys where the air has never been warm, along the worn surface of Helveg, toward the roaring sound of Gjöll in the distance. This is not a punishment. This is not a failure. This is the road taken by nearly everyone, running toward the place that holds nearly everyone, administered without sentiment by the figure who was placed in governance there by the decision of a god and the specific weight of her parentage. The hall that receives her is quiet. That quality, the quiet, is perhaps what the sources most consistently suggest about Hell's realm. Not the torment of other traditions' underworlds, not the judgment fires, not the specific categorized suffering that other mythologies have built their afterlives around. A quiet that is not empty. The hall is vastly populated, its arrivals continuous across all the ages of the world, but is something more like the quality of a room where many people are resting, not joyful, not suffering, simply present, simply there. The Völuspá, the Old Norse poem that describes the seeress's vision of the world from its beginning to its end, gives the dead of Hell's realm a role that changes their nature in a particular way, or rather, reveals something about their nature that the quietness of the hall might obscure. At Ragnarok, the end of the current order of the cosmos, when the bound forces are released and the gods go out to their final battles, the dead of Hell's realm will sail to that battle on a ship called Nagfar. The Völuspá describes Nagfar as a physical object of considerable strangeness, a ship built from the nail clippings and the hair of the dead. Every person who arrived in Hell's Hall over every century of the world's long Middle Age contributed something small to this vessel, a thumbnail's worth, a lock of hair, each piece infinitesimally small, each piece part of something accumulating over incalculable time toward an enormous whole. The image is worth staying with. A ship being assembled, slowly, from the smallest possible pieces of the dead, not their weapons, not their bones, not the grave goods they arrived with, but the keratinous extremities, the material that had kept growing in life, and had kept growing even after life, the very last thing the body produced, before it produced nothing more. Someone, in composing this image, was thinking about accumulation, about the way small things aggregate across long time into something large enough to matter. The dead of Hell's realm were not simply held in quiet storage, waiting for a world that no longer needed them. They were being assembled, however slowly, however unconsciously, into the material of what was coming. Naglfar's departure from Hell's realm at Ragnarok is described as the ship's single voyage built over the entire age of the world, launched once. The sources suggest it was crewed by those same dead, the quiet multitudes of Eljuthnir, sailing now into the battle they had not died in, but had been building toward through the long patience of their waiting. This is a strange transformation of the straw death's meaning. Those who died on straw, who did not qualify for the Valkyrie's choosing, who traveled north and down instead of up and bright, they end up aboard Naglfar. They end up in the Norse cosmological vision, present at the largest event the tradition can describe. Not the heroes of Valhall alone, but the accumulated ordinary dead, the fever dead, and the winter dead, and the old age dead, and the drowning dead, and the child dead, and the craftsperson dead, sailing in the final hour in a ship built from what they left behind. The grave mound called a hog in Old Norse is the architectural form this belief takes in the landscape. Visible still, in Scandinavia, in Ireland, across the northern world that the Norse tradition touched. Low, rounded shapes rising from flat ground, grassed over, the grass now the same color as the grass around them, the mound itself beginning to look like something the land made rather than something humans built. Inside them, typically the objects, the weights and the spindle, whorls and the gaming pieces and the combs, the tools of trades practiced in specific valleys, in specific centuries that have long since passed. The mounds are quiet in the way Hell's Hall is quiet, not empty, not sorrowful, simply present and full of what was placed inside them and holding it undisturbed. To stand on the surface of a hog grass underfoot, ordinary sky overhead, and understand what is beneath, the careful arrangement, the objects chosen by people who loved or respected, or at least attended to the person being placed there, is to feel something that is not precisely grief, and is not precisely wonder, but partakes of both. The tradition encoded in the mound is the same tradition encoded in Hell's Hall. The dead are not nothing, they are somewhere, they are held. The place that holds them is administered with the specific kind of care that Hell herself embodies, neither warm nor cruel, neither welcoming nor refusing, simply present and equal and steady in her governance. Hell herself, in the sources that describe her, is not a figure who weeps for those she receives. She is not a figure who celebrates them. She is a figure who rules them. The Old Norse verb used in this context is the same verb used for a king's rule over a kingdom, a governance that implies order, administration, the maintenance of structure. Her hall has named furnishings that name the nature of what brought people to it. Her realm has borders with guards and a gate that shuts. These are the features of a governed place, not an abandoned one. The dead who arrive in Yggdrasil are not forgotten. They are received into governance. They are, in some meaningful sense, the tradition does not fully articulate, but consistently suggests, cared for, not with warmth, but with the cold and steady attention of a ruler who takes the responsibilities of her position without sentiment and without neglect. There is something in this that the Norse tradition finds quietly important enough to preserve across its sources. The straw death was socially complicated. The sagas record the difficulty of it. The men who lay in their longhouses and suffered through slow dying and found it harder, in some ways, than the swift ending of a battlefield because of what it meant, because of the story it told about them, because of the shape it gave to a life that had been lived in a tradition that valued a particular kind of departure. But Hell's Hall does not distinguish. The hall receives the old chieftain who died of lung sickness, and the young boy who drowned in summer, and the woman who died bearing her fifth child, and the merchant who fell from a dock in a winter storm, with the same even, impartial administration. The gate closes behind each of them. The hall makes room. The threshold Falanda Farad records each crossing with the same worn smoothness it has always had, adding the weight of each new arrival to the weight of all the arrivals before it. The craftsperson laid in the dark ground of Scandinavia 1,200 years ago, spindle whorl at the right hand, a bronze brooch still pinned at the shoulder, is somewhere the tradition believed was a real and specific and administered somewhere. Not a void, not a dissolution. Yggdrasil, the hall whose name means sleet cold, whose furnishings are named hunger and famine and sickness and the stumbling fall. A place that does not disguise what brought you to it. A place that holds, in its very architecture, the memory of every manner of dying that did not involve a sword and a choosing and a Valkyrie's recognition, and the quiet in that hall is large. Vast, in fact, the vastness of a population that has been accumulating since the first death in the world, since the first person lay on the first straw mattress in the first longhouse with the coals low, and the wind outside, and the people around them going still as the stillness spread, all of them there, the spindle hurls, and the gaming pieces, and the carpenter's tools arranged around them, or left behind in the earth, or long since decayed. It does not matter. What the tradition holds is that the person remained, was received, was governed by the figure of two aspects, one warm and one cold, who had been assigned this domain before the world found its present shape, and who continues, in the structure of the Norse cosmos, to administer it with the steadiness of something that has never been distracted, and has never rested, and has nowhere else to be. The last snow of winter lies on a grave mound, for longer than it lies on the flat ground around it. 1. The slope holds cold. The grass, when it comes through in early spring, comes through more slowly there, the ground warming later under the insulating weight of what is inside. Small violets sometimes grow on the south faces of the older mounds, where the slope catches afternoon light. These things are not in the Eddas. They are simply what happens in the physical world to the shapes that mark where the Norse dead were placed. The soil settles over them. The grass grows over the soil. The mound becomes part of the landscape, indistinguishable at a distance from any other rise in the ground, until someone who knows what to look for passes nearby and recognizes the particular roundness of it, the particular care of its construction, the fact that it is not random but placed. The tradition that built those mounds, that placed spindle whorls and gaming pieces and small wooden horses in the dark alongside people who had used them, believed in Hell's Hall, believed that the dead went somewhere specific, along a road that ran north and down, through cold valleys, over a roaring river, through a gate of iron and stone, into the care of a ruler who had been governing the same vast and quiet population since long before anyone living could remember. The hall's furnishings named the nature of departure. The hall's quiet honored the manner of arrival, and the hall received without preference and without rejection everyone the living world eventually released. The idea that this is a consolation, that the hall's impartiality is a comfort to the people who built a tradition around it, is not something the sources make explicit. The sagas record grief at slow deaths. They record the difficulty of watching someone who was strong become frail. They record the specific psychological weight of lying on straw and knowing, with the clarity that the approach of death sometimes brings, that the Valkyries are choosing elsewhere. But the tradition also built grave mounds. It also placed objects chosen with care inside them. It also sent its dead along a road that had a name, and a gate that had a name, and a ruler who had been specifically assigned and who administered with consistency what the living world eventually gave her. These are not the actions of a tradition that believed its dead were forgotten. They are the actions of a tradition that believed the dead were held, and so the hall receives another arrival. The door opened for a moment against the cold, the gray light of Helveg visible briefly in the gap, a figure stepping across the worn stone of Philandaforath. The hall does not stir, the hall does not change. The cold quality of the air inside shifts imperceptibly to accommodate one more presence, one more set of memories, one more life's weight of objects and relationships and accumulated days. The figure takes a place among the others. The door settles back. The quiet resumes, the vast, populated, impartially administered quiet of a hall that has been receiving arrivals since the world was young and will go on receiving them until the world is done, unchanged in its nature, unchanged in its governance, holding the ordinary dead of all the ordinary centuries, with the particular steadiness of something that was made for exactly this purpose and has never once been diverted from it. At the edge of the circle of gods, something small and pale rested in Loki's hands. It was, in its appearance, unremarkable. A sprig of mistletoe cut from wherever mistletoe grows. Some account places it on the branch of a tree, some further away, somewhere in the world that Frigg had moved through, gathering oaths from every substance and creature she could find, every stone and every metal and every living green thing. The mistletoe had been overlooked. It had seemed too young, perhaps, or too small, or too harmless to make the asking necessary. And so it sat in Loki's hands at the edge of the god's game, without any promise upon it, which made it, of all the things in all the 9 worlds, the only one that could do what was about to be done. The gods were laughing. This is what the accounts preserve, the specific quality of that moment, which was not solemn or ominous, but light, the way an ordinary afternoon among companions is light, everyone throwing weapons at Balder and watching each one turn aside, deflected by the oath that all of them had given, each impact harmless, the whole enterprise more like play than ceremony. Balder stood in the middle of it, untouched, the game built around his invulnerability, the joke of it being that nothing could reach him. Hother, who was blind, stood apart from the others, unable to participate. Loki approached him and offered to help him join in. The dart was placed in Hother's hand. Loki guided the direction of the throw. The mistletoe moved through the air in a low arc, small enough that no one watching would have followed it clearly. Then it struck, and Balder, who had stood through 1,000 thrown things without harm, who had stood through axes and arrows and the casual violence of the gods' amusement, fell. What the Gylfabining records of that moment is the silence that followed. The gods stood and looked at what had happened, and for a time none of them spoke. It was not how things were supposed to be. The oaths were supposed to hold. The afternoon was supposed to continue. Balder was supposed to be standing. And then, when the first responses came, there was grief, open and immediate, because the Aesir were not a culture that concealed mourning, and because Balder, whom the tradition describes as the most beautiful and the most gentle of the gods, was gone from among them, and the going was so sudden, so complete, that the world above felt it as a physical change in the quality of the air. Frigg was the first to speak. She asked who among the gods would ride to Hel, ride to the realm itself, to Hel the figure, Hel who ruled in her cold hall below everything, and offer a ransom, or a trade, or whatever price might be asked, in exchange for Balder's return. The Eka in the tradition are not a people who accept permanence easily. They move against things. They attempt, and so the offer was made, and the one who answered it was Hermoth, sometimes called the Swift, the one who could be relied upon for a journey that others might not attempt. Odin brought out Sleipnir. The horse is worth a moment of attention here. 8-legged gray, the fastest thing in all the 9 worlds, born of Loki's own shapeshifting during an earlier story, and kept by Odin in Asgard for exactly the kind of mission that no ordinary horse could carry. Sleipnir's gait was not like a horse's, 8 hooves striking the ground in a rhythm that ordinary ears were not quite equipped to count correctly. Something between a gallop and a run, a sound that the road to Hel had almost certainly heard before, though not often. Hermother mounted. The gates of Asgard opened. He rode. The journey takes 9 nights in the account, and the route runs consistently downward and northward, deeper into the Earth's cold body, further from the warmth and light that accumulated in the southern parts of the cosmos, further from Asgard and Midgard, and everything that smelled of smoke and living things. The valleys through which Sleipnir moved were dark. This is a detail the tradition is precise about. Not dark in the way that valleys are dark at night, when there is still the possibility of stars, still the knowledge that dawn is coming, but dark in the way that the inside of the earth is dark, where no light has ever entered and none is expected. The hooves on the road, all 8 of them, and the cold air moving past at speed, and the gradually deepening silence of a world that had less and less in it the further they went. Hermother did not count the nights in the way that someone crossing an ordinary landscape might count them. He rode. The nights accumulated. At some point on the 9th, the sound of rushing water reached him from ahead, rising in volume as the road descended, until it was loud enough to be heard above the hoofbeats and the wind of the ride. The river Gjöll, the roaring river, the one whose sound carried further than almost anything else in that part of the world, the last audible evidence of the living realm's connection to the waters that flowed from the well of Hevergomir, far above. The bridge Galarbru appeared across it, a structure spanning the current, and on the bridge, standing quite still, was the bridge keeper Mothgwath. She watched him approach. When Hermoth reached her, she asked him what she needed to know, who he was, what he was doing on this road, why a single living man's passage across Galarbru shook the bridge as much as the 5 companies of dead men who had crossed it the day before. The accounts give her this quality throughout: observational, accurate, neither welcoming nor obstructing, simply doing the work of the position she held, which was to know what was crossing the bridge and why. Hermothr told her he was riding to Hel to find Baldra, to see what could be done about his return. Hermothr confirmed what he was looking for. Baldra had crossed this bridge. He had passed this way already, moving in exactly the direction Hermothr was now heading, downward and northward, further into the dark. She pointed the way, as though there were a way to point to, a direction that a rider could take from the bridge and follow, which there was. Helgrind was ahead, the great gate of Hel's realm, the bars through which the dead passed, and which closed behind them, standing at the deepest reach of the road. Sleipnir's 8 hooves found the ground again, on the far side of the river. The sound of the water faded behind them as they continued north. Hermoth reached Helgrind. What the Gylfaginning records is not the opening of the gate, but the clearing of it. Sleipnir gathering and leaping over the bars, rather than waiting for any mechanism of entry, carrying Hermothr over and into the realm beyond, in a single movement that the horse was, apparently capable of. And then the interior of the realm, and the road continuing, and at its end the hall, Eiluthnir, the Hall of Hel, whose name the tradition holds as meaning something between sleet cold and the misery of wet cold weather, damp and chill, as the interior of a space that has never been warmed and expects no warming. Hermoth rode toward it and then entered it, and the accounts say plainly what he found there. Baldur was seated in the place of honor. He was there in the hall, seated as one who had been received and placed and settled into the order of the place, which was Hel's order, which received everyone who came to it and put them somewhere and kept them. Baldur's appearance is not described in detail at this point in the account, and the restraint of that is itself informative. He was there. He was bald, whatever quality the living world had known him by. The brightness, the gentleness, the quality of being the one among the gods who was liked by everything and every creature that encountered him. These did not appear to have left him. He was simply in the hall now, instead of above it. Hermothr stayed the night. The tradition gives this detail with its usual matter-of-fact precision. He stopped, he stayed. The night passed in the hall of hell, among the cold air and the quiet of a place where nothing was hurrying, where no one was leaving in the morning, where the ordinary movements of preparation for departure did not apply. In the morning, by whatever the hall's reckoning of morning was, Hermother went to speak to hell. She sat in the accounts as she sits throughout, not on a throne of terror, not surrounded by the apparatus of threat, but present in her hall as its ruler, which was all she had ever been asked to be, and which she had been since Odin placed her here, in the deepest part of the world, and gave her the charge of all who died by means other than battle. Hermothrod brought his request to her plainly. He explained what had happened: Baldur's death, the grief of the gods, the need as the Aesir experienced it, to do something, to try, to make some offer that might change what had happened. He asked for Baldur's release. Hill considered what he had said. The tradition does not describe her as moved by it. It does not describe her as cold toward it either. Exactly. What it describes is a ruler governing by her own principle, which was a principle of impartiality. She did not play favorites. She did not release the dead because their deaths were mourned more than others, or because the living who wanted them back were more insistent or more beloved. She had a condition, and the condition was this: if everything in all the worlds would weep for Bald, then she would send him back. Everything, living and dead, animate and inanimate, stone and metal and tree and soil, all of it weeping, all of it registering the loss in the only way that a thing without language can register a loss, which is through moisture, through the condensation of grief in the cold air, every surface wet with what it could offer. If that happened, then Bald could return. Hermold rode back. He carried the condition north and upward, back across Galarbrew, back through the dark valleys, back through the 9 nights of road, until he reached Asgarth and delivered what Hel had told him. And then the gods sent messengers out into all the worlds, to every substance and creature, asking each one to weep for Bald. The accounts describe this as going largely as hoped. The stones wept, the metals wept, the trees and grasses and living creatures wept, each in the way available to it, each offering the moisture of something that had been affected by Baldur's light and was now without it. The oaths Frigg had gathered from everything to protect Baldur had demonstrated that everything knew him, had been in some relation to him, had agreed to him as part of the world's structure, and so everything could weep. Almost everything. There is a cave in the accounts, and in the cave there is a figure, a giantess named Thek, sitting in the dark, to whom the messengers also came, because everything in all the worlds meant everything, and Thek was a thing in the world. The messengers came to her and asked her to weep. She answered them in verse, a brief and flat and mocking set of lines that the prose Edda preserves. Baldur had meant nothing to her, she said, living or dead. Let Hel keep what she had. The messengers left the cave. The prose Edda states then, with its usual directness, that Theodub was Loki in disguise. This is the shape of what the account holds. The same figure who had placed the mistletoe dart in Huther's hand, who had moved at the edge of the gods' laughing circle to bring about what no weapon or creature would have done willingly, this same figure had then also sat in a cave, in a giantess's shape, and given the refusal that kept the condition from being met. The cause of Baldur's death and the cause of his non-return were the same. It is not presented in the tradition as ironic. It is presented as what happened, which is its own kind of observation about the shape of some events. That the same movement that brings a thing down is also, in some cases, the one that keeps it down, and that this is not a violation of any law, but simply a feature of how certain forces operate. The condition was not met. Baldur was not returned. The messengers went back to Asgarthur, and Baldur remained in Eleuthir, and the world above began its long process of continuing without him, which is to say, it continued as a world already moving toward Ragnarok, already aging, the particular brightness of Baldur's presence no longer moving among the gods in Asgard, no longer available as the thing in the world that nothing wished to harm. The gods were not the same in his absence. The tradition implies this without dwelling on it. The texture of Asgard, the quality of the light there, the sense of what the realm of the gods was, all of this shifted when Baldur left it and did not fully return. Hel's Hall took him in. This is what the tradition records. Eleuthir, the sleet-cold hall, the damp weather hall with its named furnishings, and its threshold worn smooth by every arrival, received Baldur as it received every arrival, without fanfare or ceremony, with the simple organizational principle of a place that had a function and fulfilled it. He sat in the high seat, which the accounts mention as his specific position, a detail that carries something in it, because the high seat in Norse domestic life was the place of honor, the position of the guest most valued, and this is where Hel put him, which says something about how the hall understood what had come to it, even if the understanding was quiet and unannounced. The question that sits beneath this part of the story, the question the tradition does not answer in any plain way, but allows to accumulate through the texture of the account, is what Baldur was doing there. Not in the practical sense. The dead came to Hel's Hall, and Baldur was dead, and so Baldur was in Hel's Hall, and the logic was complete. But in the other sense, the slower one, the sense of what it is to be somewhere for a very long time in a hall that does not change, while the world above moves through all its seasons and its battles and its slow deterioration toward the ending that the Norse tradition holds to be inevitable. Baldur sat in the high seat of Eleuthir, and Asgard went on without him, and the worlds went on, and the long movement toward Ragnarok continued at whatever pace such things move. The Völuspá holds a vision of what comes after Ragnarok, and it is worth arriving at that vision slowly, through the shape of what precedes it, because the ending the Norse tradition describes is not simply destruction, but a sequence destruction, and then something else, which the oldest sources describe with a specificity that prevents it from being read as mere comfort. The world burns, the sea rises over it, the sun is swallowed, the gods fall. Yggdrasil, the great ash tree whose roots reached into all 9 worlds, and whose branches spread across everything, shudders. The wolf Fenrir, Baldur's sibling in origin, breaks his chains. Jomungandr, the Midgard serpent, rises from the ocean floor. The ship Nagvar, made from the nail clippings and hair of the dead, accumulated over all the ages of the world, sets out across the risen sea, carrying the accumulated dead of Hel's realm toward the final battle. These are not the events of a world ending cleanly, closing like a book, finished. They are the events of a world completing a cycle whose length is so great that the portion of it available to any living thing is too small to perceive the shape of what the cycle is. And then, after, the Völuspá's vision continues past the falling of the gods, the sea recedes, the earth surfaces again, wet, dark at first, and then green, the green of a world that has been underwater and is now coming into air, and light for what feels like the first time, though it is not the first time, but the next time. Fields grow without being sown. The eagle hunts over waterfalls that are moving through a landscape that is still new and dark and wet. The surviving gods find each other on the plain of Yggdrasil, and they sit together in the grass, and they begin to speak of what they remember, And one of the things they do in the Völuspá's account is find, in the grass, the golden game pieces that the gods had played with before all of this happened. The objects of the previous age recovered, and Baldur returns. The Völuspá names him specifically as one of those who will come back from Hel's realm into the renewed world. Baldur, together with his brother Höður, the blind god whose hand had been guided by Loki, who had thrown the dart without knowing what he was doing, who had also died in the events that followed Baldur's death, and had also gone to Hel's hall. The two of them, the account says, will inhabit the world after the world. They will come back into the light of a sun. The Völuspá describes a daughter of the old sun rising to take her mother's place in the sky, and they will find a world still wet and new, still organizing itself into its own form, still becoming what it will be. This is what Baldur was doing in Eljuthnir. This is what the hall was doing with him, holding him the way a hall holds whatever it is given and keeps it until the time changes. Not a punishment, not a defeat. The tradition offers no sense that Baldur's time in the Hall of Hel was experienced as loss, or that the hall experienced his presence as anything other than what it was, another arrival, given the high seat, sitting in the cold quiet of Eljuthnir, while the world above went about its long business. The cold of the hall would not have changed. The named furnishings, the bed called Kor, the dish called Hung, the knife called Solter, the threshold called Philandaforath, would have remained as they were, each object carrying its name, in the way that old objects carry meaning, quietly, without needing to announce it. The air in the hall would have had its quality of damp, cold weather, of sleet against stone, the same atmosphere the hall's name pointed toward and had always pointed toward. And Baldur would have been there in all of it. The brightness of him, whatever the tradition means by Baldur's brightness, which is not exactly a visible light, but something more like the quality of being well disposed toward, the quality of existing in harmony with rather than against. That brightness persisting in the cold interior of Eljuthnir without diminishing, because the hall contained things but did not change them, did not subtract from what they were. The Norse tradition does not dwell on the interior experience of the dead. It describes the structure of the realm, the organization of its halls, the fates assigned to different kinds of the dead, the great eschatological events in which the dead play their parts. But it does not often describe what a particular dead person was thinking or feeling in the long time between arrival and the end of the world. This restraint is one of the qualities that makes the tradition feel old. It describes from the outside, it names the structure, it follows the events, and it trusts the listener to understand what it is leaving in the spaces between those named things. The space in which Baldur sat in the high seat of Eljuthnir for however long it took the world to move from the moment of his death to the moment of Ragnarok is one of those spaces. The tradition names the beginning and the end of it, and leaves the middle as what it is, a long and quiet time in a cold hall at the bottom of the world, the kind of time that has no events in it worth recording because it is itself a kind of waiting, and waiting does not require description to be understood. There is something worth sitting with in the image of a being whose presence was associated with light and with the affection of everything in all the worlds, spending the long age of the world's final decline in the Hall of Hel, not as a tragic irony, not as a punishment devised by anyone. Hela was not punishing Baldur, she was simply keeping him, as was her function, as she kept everyone, and not as a waste, which is how a certain kind of reading might approach it. Looking at the brightness of what Baldur was, and the cold darkness of where he ended up, and finding the distance between them distressing, the tradition does not frame it as distressing. The tradition frames it as a fact of the cosmological structure that Balder died, that Hel's Hall received him, and that the Hall would also release him when the time came. The Hall was not a permanent condition, it was a place of keeping, and Balder was kept there, in the high seat, in the cold, waiting with the patience of something that did not need to be anywhere else. The Völuspá's vision of the New World is spare and quiet in its presentation. The surviving gods sit in the grass of Yggdrasil and speak about the old world, about Odin's serpent, about the great things of the previous age, in the way that people sit and speak about what they remember, when what they remember is the only thing they share, and the ground around them is still new. And into this gathering come Balder and Hugthur from Hel. The account does not describe the arrival dramatically. It names it as part of the New World's inventory. These are the things that will be there, the returning gods, the golden game pieces in the grass, Balder and Huth from the realm of the dead, the daughter of the old sun in the sky, the fields that will grow without needing to be sown. The inclusion of Balder in that list is the tradition's own resolution of the story it began, with the mistletoe dart. What was thrown sideways, what fell when it should have been standing, what descended into the cold hall and stayed there through the long decline of the world, it comes back. Not because the tradition promises that things come back, not as a general comfort offered to anyone who has lost something, but because this specific story was told this way, because the account that holds Balder's death in Hel's Hall also holds his return in the New World's morning, and the two ends of the story are part of the same telling. Eljuthnir sits in the dark and the cold below everything, its threshold worn smooth, its interior quiet, its ruler present in the way that the ruler of a large and unhurried realm is present, attentive, impartial, holding the space and its order together across the whole span of time between the making of the worlds and the end of them. The dead arrive, the hall receives them, the named furnishings remain named, the cold air remains cold. The walls of the hall contain all of it, without effort, the way that something built for a specific purpose and used consistently for that purpose acquires a settled, permanent quality. Not interesting in the way that new things are interesting, but solid in the way that very old things that have not failed in their function are solid. Hel herself sits within this quiet order as its center. The tradition describes her two-toned form, one half the color of living flesh, one half the blue-black of something that has been past warmth for a long time. And this division was not an accident of birth, or a wound, or a deficit of any kind, but the description of what she was, a figure simultaneously of the living world and of the dead one, holding both in her form, the way her realm held both the memory of the living world and the fact of the dead. She was given this realm by Odin's decision, and she ruled it according to the principle that seems to have been its governing principle from the beginning. Everyone who came to her came on equal terms, and everyone who came was received, and the hall made room. The specific quality of that reception, the matter-of-fact orderliness of it, the absence of judgment or hierarchy, or the kind of sorting that characterizes some other traditions' underworlds, is perhaps the most distinctly Norse thing about Eljuthnir. The dead who arrived were not weighed, were not evaluated for their moral record, were not sent somewhere good or somewhere bad, depending on what they had done while living. The dead who arrived had simply not died in battle. That was the distinction that mattered, not virtue, not piety, not the quality of the life lived, but the manner of the dying. And the manner of the dying was often not chosen, which is to say that the majority of the dead in Hel's Hall arrived there not because of who they were, but because of how the body fails, because of what illness does, because of what cold and age and time due to the physical structure of a living thing. They came to the hall. The hall held them. In the long dark between Baldur's death and the end of the world, the hall would have continued doing exactly this. Other dead arriving, one at a time or many together, crossing the threshold Philandafarath, the stumbling block, the door whose name remembers the final fall of every person who has ever crossed it. The hall making room, hell present in her place, the cold air moving gently through the interior, the whole structure of the realm persisting in the way that the tradition describes it as having always persisted, stable, ordered, complete in itself, not waiting for anything except what the cosmological sequence had always said would eventually arrive. And in the high seat, through all of that, Baldur Dveit, his brightness in the cold, the hall around him, holding its shape and its quiet, the world above changing in all the ways the tradition says it changed, the slow deterioration of the age, the wars, the moral decline, the distance between gods and mortals growing, Ragnarok approaching through all the long time of the world, and none of it touching the interior of Eleuthir, which was below change, below the reach of what happened above, stable in the way that the deepest parts of the earth are stable, insulated by their depth from everything that moves at the surface. The tradition has held this image for as long as the tradition has existed, which is to say for a very long time, passed through generations of telling and recollection, and the eventual writing down that preserved it in the forms that survive. The Hall of Hell, cold and quiet, with its named objects and its worn threshold and its ruler dividing the world of the living from the world of the dead down her own center, and in the high seat of that hall, a god whose brightness had not gone out, sitting in the dark and the cold with the patience of something that has been given all the time that exists. What the story carries, in the end, is not grief. The tradition is precise about this in its own way. It names the grief of the gods. When Baldur fell, it records Frigg's asking and Hermodr's writing and the weeping of everything that could weep. And then it moves to the condition and the condition's refusal and the finality of what followed, all in the same calm and unhurried account. The grief is there in the account because the account is accurate and the loss was real, but the account does not remain in the grief. It moves through it to the shape of what the tradition holds, which is Eleuthir receiving Bald, the hall containing him, the cosmological sequence continuing its long movement toward the moment when the sea rises and falls back, and the new earth comes up, green and wet, into the light of the daughter of the old sun. Bald comes back in the morning of the next world, Höthr with him, the two gods who ended one world, one by the action of his hand, one by the action of his death, present at the beginning of the next, seated with the surviving gods in the grass of Yggdrasil, the golden game pieces around them, the new world organizing itself quietly into its own form. Eleuthir sits below all of this, still, the threshold still worn smooth, the cold air still moving through the interior, the realm of hell still in its place at the deepest root of the world, still receiving, still holding, still doing the thing it was made to do in the time before the other worlds were fully shaped. The hall was there before most of the story the tradition tells, and the tradition does not say it will not be there after.